Hey guys, so in this video, we're going to talk about Cloudflare, and I'm going to try to make a compelling argument as to why you should actually move your workloads over to Cloudflare. Now, this is based on my personal experience. Over the last few years, I've been using Cloudflare heavily, and definitely within the last year or so, I've been a diehard Cloudflare fan. And so this is me just sharing my experience about Cloudflare and giving you some of the insights as to how you should be thinking about Cloudflare. I want to be clear with this right off the top. This is not a sponsored video. I'm not affiliated with Cloudflare by any single means. That being said, Cloudflare, if you're watching this, listen, I will not refuse your money in any single way. So let's just be real about that. I run a business. I talk about business. I'm focused on business. So yeah, I have no issues taking your money. That being said, getting that out of the way, the reason why I'm doing this video is because I wish I had a video like this to kind of understand Cloudflare at sort of like a macro level and then sort of be a little more specifics about some of the tools. And personally, I feel like, honestly, this is just my subjective opinion here. I feel like the Cloudflare team do not do a good enough job of just highlighting how good their services is. I don't think they understand how good their system is. Now, that's just me being subjective with my opinion. But for this reason, I've created a channel that is kind of focused on Cloudflare, but also my journey as an entrepreneur. And with that, I hope you're going to get some value from this video. I'm going to try to give you sort of an overview of why Cloudflare matters. I'm going to try to give you a comparison to sort of traditional infrastructure. And then we're also going to talk about some of the pros and cons of Cloudflare. Now, there's lots of upsides, but there's also some downsides. And I'm even going to share one story with you about how they locked my account at one given point. So it can give you sort of an overall picture, and then hopefully you can make the right decision about whether this works for you or not. Okay. So with that, let's just talk about who this video is for. So I'm actually talking to entrepreneurs, business owners, people that are sort of like in the business world that are kind of looking to evaluate cloud platforms. That's number one. And number two, if you're a seasoned developer, you've been around the block for a while, you're Java, .NET, or any of the umpteen languages that exist on the internet, but you're kind of a traditional sort of developer and you're kind of heard about this Cloudflare, but you don't really know how to think about it or even how to approach sort of the topic. So that's kind of the two audiences I'm talking to. Why am I tackling two audiences? Because I myself, I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm also a developer. I like to think of myself as sort of like I sit between the intersection of business and technology. That being said, I've also had about 20 years of experience doing .NET development and more the traditional way of doing things. So hopefully that's given you some insight as to why, or at least the reasons for me being qualified to talk about this topic. Okay, so let's talk about sort of the overview of the Cloudflare platform, because I think it's for you to understand what Cloudflare is. It's really, really important for me to sort of kind of give you a level set of sort of the landscape about Cloudflare altogether and why I'm actually making a move to Cloudflare and why every single thing for me is Cloudflare. So let's talk about what I call the 20K wake up call. Okay. So I'll give you a story. About 5 or so years ago, my Azure bills were averaging about 20K per month. Okay. The reason for that is we had a lot of workloads that were kind of sitting in paying for virtual computers so that we could run all sorts of workload. And a lot of them were expensive for the reasons because we had legacy software that we were running. And a lot of them they required a significant amount of compute in order to get things right. So with that, as a result of that, we ended up building out a lot of virtual computers in order to kind of keep up with the demand. The application was predominantly a .NET, ASP.NET, MVC application. For any .NET fans, you kind of know what I'm talking about there. For anybody that's not familiar, it was basically a traditional web application with a server and a backend and a database. The problem was that it's a startup. I still own this company. There is just a lot of expenses associated with very little gains in terms of performance and returns that we were getting from our customers. Customers were paying us way less than our server costs. And so it just wasn't a sustainable model. For this reason, I've been very aggressively trying to rethink what it means to be in the cloud. If you look on the internet across the board, you will see tons of companies reassessing their cloud bills and deciding that they're going to move things in-house and start hosting their own stuff again because it's significantly cheaper. That being said, I'm now one of those people that wants to maintain and manage servers. That is not my mission. That is not my goal. So I've been on a mission to figure out how can I let somebody else manage the entire cloud, deal with all the headaches, but give me a platform that is super scalable and does not require sort of that upfront headache, but also does not require some of the upfront cost that's required to build out the scalable infrastructure. So that's been my mission and goal, is to find a hybrid between having an extremely scalable system, but not have to build out all that infrastructure and incur the cost ahead of time. That was sort of the problem. That's sort of the primary reason that led me over to Cloudflare. Now, over time, I've been able to move that bill, the Azure $20,000 bill, all the way down to $256 per month. You heard me right. From a $20,000 bill to a $256 a month per bill. Now, I just want to be clear with this and put an asterisk here. That is not because I moved every single workload over to Cloudflare. In fact, I still have workloads currently today in Azure, and I will never move them out of Azure. So this is not a conversation of I've moved all of my infrastructure from Azure and put it into Cloudflare and now I'm saving significant more money. It's I've just been on a personal journey to figure out how to be most efficient while still maintaining the level of cloud efficiency and scalability at the cheapest cost possible. So that's been the reason, that's been my motivation for sort of making that jump. And that's the reason why I've been just going extremely deep on Cloudflare and understanding sort of the infrastructure across the board. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's just talk a little bit about why and what actually is Cloudflare. Because the reality is Cloudflare is a lot of things. It's really a full-fledged cloud offering solution. If you've ever heard about Cloudflare, the first thing that you probably would have heard is that it's a security company and they focus on security. In fact, their entire business is all about securing applications in the cloud infrastructure for really large enterprise companies. And so with this, I would describe it as they're kind of a victim to their own success, in the sense that because of the fact that they have such a fundamental strength in the security landscape, most people just assume that they're just a security company. And what I will say about that is that because that's 100% true. However, I think in the last 5 years, this is me making sort of a projection of what I think the business owners at Cloudflare did, is they recognize that in order for them to keep winning the game of security, they have to do a couple things. Number one is they need as many websites on their platform as possible. Why? Because then they could inspect the traffic across the board and they could actually improve their services. That's number one. Again, I'm just making projections here. This is by no means, I have no inside knowledge on why this is the case, that they've made this decision that we'll talk about in a bit. I'm just basically sort of making a high level assessment of how I would be thinking about the business if I were the quote unquote CEO of Cloudflare, which I'm not, by the way. So I think there was a meeting one day, I can imagine walking into an office with the Cloudflare team and being like, guys, we need to sell more security services. And they were like, yes, you're right. How should we do that? Let's hire more salespeople. And they're like, no, we're going to give developers what they want. And I was like, well, how do we do that? We're going to build the most scalable, the most secure, the simplest and easiest platform for you to be able to deploy at scale cloud solutions. That's what I think the CEO said. And they're like, oh, that's cool. So how do we sell security then? Oh, I got you. So here's what you do. You sell all of this stuff to the developers for free, for super, super cheap, so that it just makes it so easy for them to join onto your platform and for them to build their apps. And then one day, what will happen is that their system or their websites will grow so large that they're going to need security because somebody is attacking them. And guess what? Because they're on Cloudflare, who wins? Us. Okay, enough of the jokes. I just think that's cool because I probably imagine a meeting going like that, even though I know that's not the case. But the point is that that's just what I think happened. I think that they have recognized that in order for them to build, and to be honest with you, I've actually watched a video of the CEO of Cloudflare, its co-founder of Cloudflare, and they mentioned that one of their mission is to give things cheap so that they could acquire users and then they could charge them on the enterprise level side. That's their business model. It's always been their business model. And it's a phenomenal business model because it's fundamentally different from Azure, AWS, and some of the other cloud providers. Now, I'm not saying that the other cloud providers don't do that. I'm saying that Cloudflare just takes it to a whole other level. So I think it's a brilliant strategy. It just gets buy-in from the community on so many different levels, and it works its way up to the top. And eventually you're going to need their security at some point. It's just inevitable. It's the reality of the situation. And I think it's a fantastic business model and strategy. So with that business model, we can imagine a world where your app is small and insignificant and it's cheap. And then at some point your app grows and it gets big because you maybe got funding and maybe it got 100 million users or something. And suddenly you need a lot more security. And that's when the sales guys are going to call. That being said, I think it's a win-win for everybody across the board. Why? Because on the front end, the developers win. They have scalable solutions that they can deploy instantly. And in fact, I'm going to show you later on in this video exactly how those solutions scale. And then the Cloudflare team are able to then take your, let's call them leads, and transform them into enterprise level customers over time as they kind of see the system grow. So I think that's a win-win across the board. Okay, so with that, let's just talk about why this thing is so ridiculously good. Let's just talk about that for a bit. And in this, I'm also going to give you sort of a high level overview on how to think about Cloudflare, because it's really hard to kind of wrap your brain around sort of the business model. So here I have sort of like what I would consider the two end of the spectrum when it comes to cloud platforms altogether. On one side of the spectrum, you have the platforms of the world. These are your enterprise level platforms, the ones we're all familiar with: AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, DigitalOcean, to name a few. I put DigitalOcean there because they're a smaller player, but they're kind of sort of competent in that sort of space. And the way how these systems work is you need to have essentially seasoned developers that are going to manage these services, etc. And there's whole entire industries and certifications and stuff that you need to kind of get this done. Okay. And then on the other hand, they have what I call the all-in-one platforms. Okay. And these platforms are essentially what they're doing is allowing you to put a website on their service, and they will spin up a database for you in the background, and they will help you with security. This is a login form, and they will help you to kind of manage your logs and manage your trends, etc. All you need to do is put a wonderful credit card into their platform, and they're just going to deal with that. So those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. Now, for me personally, because I came from sort of this back-end infrastructure, and most traditional developers would come from this sort of back-end like place, it's kind of hard for you to kind of jump from here all the way over to this end. It's just because what happens is you give up a lot of control. That's number one. And number two is, for a very small website, this works perfectly fine. However, for a really large website, the cost dramatically increases at this particular point. We'll talk about some costs with Cloudflare as well too, but in this particular case, there is some known cases where, you know, the cost does not outweigh the benefit of these platforms when you start hitting scale. Now, there's one thing to keep in mind here is that some of these platforms, Vercel, I could say for certain, all sits on AWS. So it's basically impossible for you to get a cheaper cost on Vercel than AWS. Now, so I say that with an asterisk because at the small end of the spectrum, that's 100% true. You can get cheaper costs in Vercel because Vercel is intentionally lowering their price at a very, very low entry level rate so that people can just get onto their platforms. However, as the service scales and you get more compute requirements, it's literally impossible for you to be cheaper than what you would be able to build out in AWS because of the fact that Vercel has a bill on AWS. And I can't say where these other platforms are hosted, but my guess is they're sitting on one of these clouds. They're either sitting on Google or Microsoft. So that's kind of the problem. The interesting thing for me is that Cloudflare sits directly in the middle of this equation. And to my knowledge, it's the only platform that's kind of sitting here perfectly. So what do I mean by that? Number one is it provides sort of like the low level primitives that some of the cloud providers have, but it also kind of feels like it's one of these platforms where you sign up and you could get an application deployed right away. And that's what makes it so unique because it's the only vendor that I know of at scale that is sort of like sitting and towing the line between these two worlds. And with that, it comes some interesting sort of side effects that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Number one is developers, when they look at it, they kind of think of it like the all-in-one platforms. And that's been definitely for me the hardest transition, because as a seasoned developer, I want to sit in this world where I have full control over my application. However, as a entrepreneur, I would like the speed of these platforms. So this is kind of the line that I've been kind of towing for a while, and this has been a hard mental shift for me to make as to how to switch over to Cloudflare. That being said, as AI tools become more and more prevalent, and these tools are becoming more and more popular in terms of vibe coding and building out applications, suddenly Cloudflare is becoming more and more appealing, because you can get the speed of deployment as these platform, but you can certainly get the same control, more or less, as sort of the bigger players. So that's sort of the sweet spot, and I think it's the perfect position that Cloudflare is playing. There is some caveats here, is that they don't provide everything. So I just want to be clear with this. This is not a zero-sum game. It's not all or nothing. There's some things that Cloudflare does really well. There's some things that the DIY providers do really well. And obviously there's some things that the all-in-one platform do well. But if you're a business owner and you're coming from a traditional background, or your infrastructure is in the traditional world, I would say for sure starting to shift towards that left, more towards Cloudflare would make a lot of sense. And maybe, in some reality for new apps, maybe just for speed of deployment, put them over in the all-in-one platform. So that's just my take in terms of where they fit in terms of position. The next thing I want to talk about very quickly is doubling down a little bit deeper as to how Cloudflare works. And I'm clearly not going to give you sort of an overall overview of all the different pieces of Cloudflare. This is really just to give you sort of like just a mental model to kind of think about things all together. So, and again, because we're talking to non-technical people as well as developers, I'm just sort of trying to level set it at a very high level. If you're running an application, you have to run it on some kind of computer. That's just standard. It's obvious, but I just need to state the obvious here. Okay. So imagine whether it's Microsoft Word or PowerPoint, right? Or some sort of like console application or something. It has to run on some computer somewhere. Okay. So with that, I just want to be clear with that, because there's this, concept of a serverless, which we'll talk about in a bit, and some people have this notion that there's no servers. There's always a computer in the background, period. Okay, so let's just get that out of the way. So in the olden days, you would do something like this. You'd have a computer, you put your software on it, and you run it, and then maybe you connect it to the public internet. Okay, those days are long gone. We don't do this anymore for the most part, unless you're like a hobbyist that wants to build out their own servers and their own platform. That's not who we're talking about here. If you're a business, for the most part, you're going to be sitting on Azure, AWS, or Google, and you're going to have these servers that look something like this, and they're going to be responsible for hosting your website, your web application, any of your business logic, whatever it is. They're going to be responsible for this, and obviously they're going to be charging you some dollars. Now, the challenge with this is that what these guys were doing back then is that they were just basically giving you a computer in the cloud. So you get your own independent computer. It's not necessarily fully hardware based. In other words, it's a virtual computer on a bigger computer. But the point is, you got your own independent sort of virtual computer to be able to put your workload and do whatever it is that you want with it. As time starts shifting, we got to a place where computers start moving to more of a shared server architecture. So instead of giving you a full computer, what we're basically doing is giving you just the ability to run your code on that computer. And this is sort of like the birth of AWS kind of coined this term, AWS. So it was called Lambda, L-A-M-D-A. For the business people, this is really just a way for you to execute your own piece of code. And essentially what you were doing is basically being charged for the specific execution time that code runs. And it was a much brilliant way to do things, because what it allowed the vendors to do is to basically just host as many different servers or sort of execution of code on the same server. And that's phenomenal from a business standpoint for the vendors, but also for you as a business owner. You're able to save significant amount of money because you're not paying for the entire server altogether. By the way, I'm hoping you're getting some value from this. And if you are getting some value from this, can you please like and subscribe to the video? That would really, really help me out quite a bit. This is a small channel. I'm hoping that I can spread the word about Cloudflare and also vibe coding in general and how you can build production ready app on Cloudflare. So if that's something you're interested in, please subscribe. So now that we've kind of moved from the server to more of a code execution model, this is where kind of the line gets crossed, where in the Cloudflare world, Cloudflare sits here. C-L-O-U-D, Cloudflare. Again, right. So why is this important? What Cloudflare has done is essentially make this code execution even lighter and more efficient. So instead of actually giving you your own sort of like code execution kind of path in what it is, what they have done is sort of taken that model and basically, for lack of a better word, trying to simplify the conversation here, they've essentially taken Google Chrome and they've figured out a way on how they could run independent small bits of code on top of Google Chrome. Okay, this is the best way that I could describe it to you. Now, under the hood, what's happening is instead of you running your own executable in its own sandbox, you're basically getting a tab. That's how I would describe it best. Think of it as if you open up a browser and you're in one window and you open up a new tab. Basically, that new tab would be connected to a part of the processor, and every single time you open up a new tab, you would get sort of like a different section of the processor, the CPU, right, in the computer. So that's basically what's happening. I'm oversimplifying a lot of details here, but just think of it as you're sharing CPU at a granular level rather than sharing a computer. I'm butchering this on multiple fronts deliberately. We're really just trying to get you to understand a concept rather than the technical details. There's lots of technical details, okay? But this is how you think about it. One of the problems that you run into with this particular model, with the shared server, is that the code, if let's say you're hitting your server with a whole bunch of requests, because you're getting a lot of traffic because your website is really big. Let's say your workload is spiky, meaning that sometimes your traffic is really, really high in the morning, but in the nights your traffic is non-existent or nobody's using your service in the evening hours. So what would happen is that because these servers are sharing infrastructure, they would basically put your code on local storage and have it stay there. And then whenever the first request comes in, let's say there's a new user comes to your website early morning and they hit, the server would then go fetch that sort of storage code and then put it back into memory so they could run. Now that fetching takes some time. That time is called cold start. Think of it as your computer booting up. Because if your computer is booting up, it just takes a little time before you can log in and kind of get to work, right? That's what we're called cold start. This is a huge problem in the industry altogether. I have a few videos on my channel specifically about cold start, so you can go watch those videos for more details. That being said, on the Cloudflare level, the cold start is almost non-existent. And I say non-existent because it frankly isn't. Because while here a cold start might be, let's call it anywhere from 2 to 30 seconds, depending on the cloud vendor, here you're looking at like 5 milliseconds. It is extremely, extremely fast. It's so fast that it's just indistinguishable from a regular request. That's what makes, because it's the only provider that I know that's been able to just completely eliminate this cold start problem. Now, that being said, that does come at a cost. There are some challenges around this sort of way of doing things because you don't have sort of the full code experience as a traditional infrastructure. But in my opinion, the benefits outweigh sort of like the cons. So hopefully that's giving you some sort of overview as to why Cloudflare really matters in this particular game. The next and most important thing about how Cloudflare works is the fact that those Chrome browsers, we're going to call them from this particular point Chrome browsers, okay, are really, really cheap to spin up. Cloudflare is spinning them up across the entire globe, pretty much instantaneously. Okay, there's some magic that they're doing behind the scenes because they don't need to have it in all locations all the time. But for the most part, you could just think of it like that. So whenever you have a Chrome browser, let's call this your Chrome browser, and you do a deployment to Cloudflare, Cloudflare literally spreads it out to every other part of the globe instantaneously. Okay, again, technical details don't really matter. Just understand the concepts here. It's not 100% instantaneous, and it doesn't necessarily go to all regions all the time, every single time. It just depends on traffic, etc., etc. But you don't have to think about this problem. This is not a problem that you have to think about. So for a technical developer, this is one of the biggest challenges that you will ever have to deal with if you're scaling really, really large applications, is to be able to load balance traffic across different regions. And this is something that Cloudflare just takes care for you. I have bought in so much to this sort of concept that I fell in love with this concept of deploying to region Earth. And it's such a fundamental tagline. By the way, I've been sick for the last couple of days, so if you see drool coming down my nose, just ignore it, okay? So this concept of region Earth is just a really, really cool concept that you don't have to think about your deploy. And this just makes your life as a developer so much easier than it was before. So just to give you a quick overview as to why Cloudflare is so ridiculously good. Number one, the time to value is so crazy. It's unreal. The value of being able to spin up a worker, which is the Google Chrome browser, and have it sort of instantly scale globally is just unbelievable. In fact, let me just show you how fast it is to get from 0 all the way to global scale instantaneously. So here I'm on the Cloudflare documentation, and here I have a Cloudflare worker project, and here I'm just going to copy their installation for a worker. I'm going to go to my folder. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it, so let's call it Cloudflare demo. Click enter. So basically what that's going to do is it's going to pull down their latest Cloudflare package. We're going to make a hello world project, but what we're going to do is we're going to use a framework to start. And instead of using all this, we're going to use Hono, which is sort of like the quote unquote default framework package. You could use other packages as well, but Hono is sort of like this is just an entry level application. Hono is a really good fundamental framework. I'm going to do an entire series on Hono, which if you haven't gotten the hint and you're interested in more details on this, please subscribe to the channel. Do you want to deploy to Cloudflare application? Yes. Okay. So while that's going, I'm going to just show you here. This is my Cloudflare worker pages. And in here, I don't have any application that I'm willing to show you. So in a minute here, you're going to see the Cloudflare worker deployed. So with that, it basically packaged the application and it was able to convert that to Cloudflare demo, and it's already done a deployment and given me a URL. And this is that URL right here. There, Cloudflare worker. So that is now instantly globally scalable. Okay, it's so, I mean, obviously this is a hello world, so it doesn't really give you justification, but just refreshing altogether, we're looking at 31 milliseconds for a hello world application. And I don't know how long that took, but I'm leaving the time in real time so you understand how fast it is to go from 0 to thing. Now, I want to state the obvious here. Obviously, you have to add a security. Obviously, you have to have a whole bunch of stuff behind it. And those are things that I'll show you in other videos. But the point is that the speed is just unbelievable, right? And just to show you in the worker, that application is just deployed. Once I'm in the application, I could see request logs, error logs, and I could see deployment. But this is something that's even more underrated, is the fact that if you do multiple deployments, you can actually roll back to a deployment version. Super easy. For a traditional infrastructure, there's so many different variables that you have to put in place. If I were to connect that to Git, Cloudflare would take a trigger directly off of Git, and it would be able to automatically do deployments. And every version, I think up to 30 days, you can roll back to any version up to that time frame, which is unbelievable. So if you deploy something, it was bad, your customers are unhappy because you made an update that was just terrible, you could just roll it back in one click and it just instantly goes out globally. Like that level of efficiency and just the ability to, from a developer standpoint, to just be able to push things out at a rapid pace, but then if there's a problem, roll it back instantaneously is really, really convenient. And it just sort of takes away this sort of like guesswork of, you know, should we deploy now? Should we deploy later? Because you have sort of the infrastructure, the capabilities in place to be able to keep rolling forward and roll back at a really, really fast pace. The point is that you can deploy a globally scalable API within the space of seconds. Try that on any other cloud provider and then come back and talk to me. So as I mentioned, time to value is just phenomenal. The second thing is the startup friendliness and the cost altogether, right? It's super cheap. As I mentioned, their business model is very interesting. So it's super cheap just to get started. If you're like a sub $10 million company, revenue company, like Cloudflare costs, it should be very little impact to you across the board. Now, obviously I'm making a subjective opinion here. That's not 100% true. It's based on a case by case basis, but that would be sort of the threshold, I would say, that basically separates you from like entry level company to sort of a larger enterprise company, sub $10 million in sort of revenue. And by far, I think it's one of the fastest networks, period. In fact, I don't think, I know it's the fastest network. Now, obviously, this goes into a hairy situation, but unless you're like dealing with like scientific requirements to have like the speed of light and move things so fast because you're maybe doing financial transaction or whatever, Cloudflare is one of the fastest networks out there, bar none. And the reason for that is just based on the fact that their servers are literally just everywhere in all different regions, in all different cities. And on top of that, we're talking about built-in security. 100% security is their focus. As I mentioned earlier, that is their primary mission. So it's just one of those things that you can't deny their value based on the fact that they started as a security company first. So they take security very, very seriously. All right, so let's talk a little bit just about a migration strategy. I want to be clear with this. I'm not telling you to go migrate your entire workloads from whatever provider that you have over to Cloudflare. That's not what the conversation is about. So if you're a business owner and you're watching this, please don't go tell your developers that Dwayne said that we should move to Cloudflare. Just don't do that, okay? That's just a recipe for disaster. That being said though, what I do want to make you sort of be aware of is that it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It's not an all or nothing. You can have some workloads in Cloudflare and also have some workloads in traditional application. I have a video on my channel that kind of talks a little bit more about this. I'm going to be doing more like this. If you want me to do more deep dives on this specific topic, put a comment in the chat, say deep dives, and I'm going to break down every one of these sections of this video into more detailed content, if that's something of interest to you. And it would help the channel out with interaction as well too. So with that, start small. Number one thing is do a DNS sort of like transfer to Cloudflare, and then from there work your way out from that particular point. And let me show you what I mean by that. This will allow you to sort of do like a gradual migration so that you have some workloads in traditional servers and some workloads in sort of a Cloudflare infrastructure. Let's just say, for instance, that you have your workload sort of set up on GoDaddy and you are pointing it to traditional AWS, Google, etc. Just by the way, I'm using GoDaddy as just a reference. It doesn't matter. It could be any one of your hosting providers or whatever. What you can do is, instead of just having it go directly to the providers, you can basically just have that workload, the DNS for your GoDaddy, point to Cloudflare network. Okay, this way, you're having sort of the benefit of using their entire infrastructure as sort of a shield. And then from there, you can use their rules or security tools to route the remaining standard traffic directly to your cloud vendor. Or you could add additional rules to siphon off traffic accordingly and route it over to Cloudflare and do interesting stuff there. This will give you the benefit where you could do caching and some really cool things without changing your existing infrastructure, and slowly migrate things over to Cloudflare where you could get that performance gain and speed. So this would be a recommended approach. In fact, this is the approach that I'm personally taking at this particular point. And I just want to be clear with this. For example, I have one of the most respect for Azure Cosmos DB, which is a globally scalable no SQL database. This video is not about that topic, but I'm a die-hard Azure Cosmos DB fan. I will never move that database workload into Cloudflare. They just don't have any single offerings like that. And frankly, I'm happy with sort of Cosmos DB. So that's just to show that we'll always have some workloads in Azure, and it's not a zero-sum game. I just want to make sure that you understand that point. So like I said, gradual migration, that's the way to go. And then from there, you could also start thinking about building out new technologies on Cloudflare. So instead of going to the traditional sort of way of doing things, you start siphoning out workloads where you think this, for example, AI and some of the cool stuff, and start shifting them over to Cloudflare's infrastructure that could give you some of those benefits altogether. The benefit of doing this approach is that as you start to see the benefits more and more with Cloudflare, you can start shifting more and more workloads over. And obviously, reap some of the benefits from a cost standpoint, because one, Cloudflare will handle that initial traffic if it's caching it, etc. And then it will help you to even reduce your traditional cloud architecture server costs. Okay, so let's just be real. Not every single thing is sunshines and rainbows, or rainbows and sunshine. I don't know what the saying is. Whatever it is, not every single thing has all upsides and no downsides. In fact, I want to share a personal story with you around Cloudflare. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I just want to be real with some of the challenges with any cloud provider altogether. They all have their one, vendor lock-in, which we'll talk about in a bit. And number two, they all have a side motivation. And that's just the reality. So you as a business owner or developer, you have to sort of weigh the pros and cons. This is not an all or nothing game. So let me just share my story with you so you can understand some of the things that I learned along the way. Number one was the fact that my account for Cloudflare was locked. I had an account. I remember I woke up like middle of the night, checking on my server, seeing what's going on. I got a notification that there was a problem. I logged in there, and sure enough, my application would not load. Honestly, like every developer's worst nightmare, every IT person's worst nightmare. Your application is not loading. Your customers are freaking out, wondering what's going on. So naturally, I start checking the servers, etc., see what's going on. Sitting in Azure, every single thing is fine. That's weird. So start checking on Cloudflare side to see what's going on with the network. Was able to log into my account, but there was a big message in there: your account has been suspended. Whoa, what the hell's going on? After a little bit of trial and error figuring out what's going on, it turns out that it was a billing problem. Now get this, I'm not making this story up. My account, the credit card that was on file, was trying to be in charge for about 3 months. So apparently, Cloudflare was trying to bill my credit card for about 3 months, and they were unable to do so for a whole bunch of reasons. The primary one was the fact that I actually switched my credit card. I switched the credit card, but didn't update the credit card on file. And what I noticed in some of my other cloud providers, that even though I switched my credit card, some of the providers were still able to bill me. And I just assumed that Cloudflare was still billing me. It just never got in there and checked it. So you could say it's my fault. And that's the truth. But the experience taught me something even more valuable. So Cloudflare shut my account down. I tried to reach out to support, and I got no real response from them, and I was freaking out because I needed to get my application back up and running for my customers. So the only single thing I did, I was like, I just need to make a ton of noise. So I just started messaging everybody on Twitter. I messaged the CEO, I messaged the IT person, I went on LinkedIn, I found their profiles, I messaged them independently, and sure enough, after a couple of hours, the CTO, or one of the guys, I forgot who it was, but one of the really higher ups, did actually say, okay, we're going to have somebody look into this. And within the matter of like an hour or two, it was resolved. Guess what? My account, they were trying to charge my account. It was no more than $4. It was like $3.98 or something like that. And they could not get it charged. And as a result, my entire account was locked. That's how crazy it was. I was running my entire business on Cloudflare. I just want to let you understand how cheap the service was, because we have at least 4 or 5 different apps on Cloudflare, and it's just stupidly cheap. I don't know how they're making money, but we're benefiting from it, and we're really, really thankful for sort of the work that those guys are doing. But the point is that my account was locked because of a bill for $3.98. But in either case, it goes to show that what it made me realize was I should not have all my eggs in one basket. And if you're a developer or IT person and you're familiar with, how the cloud vendors try to lock you in, having all your eggs in one basket could be detrimental to your business. So since then, I've sort of pulled back from having all in on Cloudflare on certain types of workloads. So I will never have all of my DNS or domain name registered and hosted with Cloudflare, for the very reason that I can put it with GoDaddy or whoever, pick your favorite domain name register, and I will point it to Cloudflare and have a backup system in place that in the event that there's a problem with Cloudflare, I can switch it directly to, say, AWS or Azure, etc. The point is that you need to be thinking about this from a scalability standpoint. And there have been recent cases where Cloudflare has had outages that are really major. And so as a result, being able to sort of instantly switch your DNS or your DNS records has some value from that perspective. Just want to put it out there that it's not all sunshines and rainbows. That being said, though, the biggest thing that I will say, or the biggest disadvantage that you'll have with Cloudflare, is vendor lock-in. Okay, but of recent, with like the Hono framework, which again I'll do some more videos about that in things. It's sort of platform agnostic, where you can use their framework instead of relying on Cloudflare's sort of like core APIs. You're using the Hono API, which adds a layer of abstraction, which theoretically speaking allows you to move it over to something else. So that's one that's definitely of value, but definitely something you have to think about is the vendor lock-in is real. Once you're in the Cloudflare ecosystem, you're kind of in that ecosystem. I kind of equate it to the Apple ecosystem, which once you're in the Apple ecosystem, suddenly you bought an iPhone, next thing you know, you're buying a laptop, next thing you know, you're buying AirPods, you're just kind of going deeper and deeper. And that's definitely the case with Cloudflare altogether. I've mentioned the billion horror story. That's a real thing altogether. And the $3 payment really made me realize some of the challenges with having all my eggs in one basket. And I've since pulled back from that. And the enterprise cost creep is also real. There's tons of horror stories about people moving their entire workloads to Cloudflare, getting all the security. They were on a $20 a month plan. Suddenly they have to pay $200. Next thing you know, they're paying thousands of dollars because of some sort of weird issue or high traffic or whatever it is. Those situations are sort of independently unique to each company. But the point is that that is a real thing. But like I said, from my own personal experience, if you're in like sub $10 million sort of company, I think you could get away like with significantly reducing your cost. Don't quote me on that, but my point is that's from just my observation, and it obviously depends on the type of company and the type of application that you're building altogether. And altogether, what I will say is that there are some ecosystem gaps with Cloudflare. So it's not all sunshines and rainbows where they have all the features for all the stuff. So there are some feature gaps. They've been working really hard to close those feature gaps because they recognize that this has been sort of a limitation in having people move over to Cloudflare. But all in all, the ecosystem is just fundamentally great. Okay, so I've kind of rambled a lot about the entire ecosystem. Hopefully I made sort of a case for Cloudflare. And again, I want to be clear with this. I'm not a sponsored person for Cloudflare. I have no affiliation with them. I don't make any money from these guys, although I will take some money from them if they want to throw it my way. I just want to basically share just my own personal experience and give a video that I think would benefit a lot of developers that are sort of traditional developers to be able to understand why Cloudflare is so good, and also a business person to be able to kind of have some high level understanding of why it works so well. So the one thing that I think that is sort of limiting a lot of people from being able to switch to Cloudflare is the paradigm shift. It is a real thing, because the way how you think in traditional development is not the same as how you would think in Cloudflare, and obviously not the same as how you would think in some of the all-in-one platform. That paradigm shift, I think, is what's limiting a lot of technical developers from being able to make that switch. It took me a while to make that switch, and I couldn't really wrap my head around some of the offerings. And I think that attributes to the fact that Cloudflare's marketing team, this is not a knock on the marketing team. I just don't think that the marketing team truly understands or figured out or has mastered a way to sell this product in a better way. That's just my personal opinion. I may be wrong about that. I'm sure they're doing some amazing things, and they are, because I could see them. But I think they're kind of community driven. At least that's how I feel about Cloudflare. It feels like there's kind of a big Cloudflare community, and the marketing feels like it's community driven from the ground up, rather than sort of like, I don't even know what's the alternative of that, other than I feel like there's just some gaps in the way that they're thinking about the marketing. That's my personal experience about it. So not every developer, like I said, will buy into this, and that's okay. You do you, right? But if you want to have your high Azure bills or AWS bill or Google bill, go right ahead. I won't stop you. Okay. For me personally, I've seen sort of the benefits. Like I said, I moved from a $20,000 bill to a $256 bill. That is no joke. And from that, I've just been a diehard convert. And like I said, the scalability factor is just unmatched, at least in my opinion, at this particular point. So with that, hopefully you've gotten some value from this. If you have gotten some value and you want more deep dives on very specific areas, because obviously this is a very broad topic that I'm just kind of covering at a high level, feel free to put some comments in the chat. In fact, please put a comment in the chat if you got some value from this video. It would really help me out. And also, if you want to see future videos about this topic. Like I said, my focus is building scalable, production-ready applications on Cloudflare that are vibe coded. Okay, that's my claim to fame. So with that, have yourself a wonderful day, and I'll see you in another video.